So in the last year, proof of stake has come like a long, long way. Where there's been a very, very large amount of research and new directions. And it kind of invalidates a lot of the common knowledge about proof of stake. And I hope we're gonna, quickly cover some of the progress and then get to some of the contention, some of the points of contention that is still kind of in proof of stake design. I guess I'll just introduce everyone. So this is Dominic Williams, founder of Pebble.
Yeah, we are developing a cryptocurrency, and we've been experimenting with various combinations of proof of stake and conventional Byzantine consensus. So we use something called sureties, where nodes are joined to the network by posting a surety, which is staked upon their good behavior. And we use it as a sort of civil defense mechanism and as a way of identifying assigning financial resources to cryptographic identities so that these identities can take place as individual messaging actors within a consensus system.
Zach Hess has developed Vitalik's original slasher algorithm and is like a proof of stake expert. Was with Augur for a while in prediction markets. I don't know.
I try to be a rapid prototyper. When ideas come around, I try to make them right away. So I've been working on a proof of stake blockchain, kind of like his. It's got people that give bonds, and they verify the blocks. And if they behave poorly, then they lose their bond. Yeah.
And Jake Wan, Tendermint. I guess.
Yeah. Hello. Tendermint is also a proof of stake consensus algorithm. It uses bonding. And it also uses traditional Byzantine agreement algorithms to come to consensus. There's also testnet, so it's just starting.
I'm Vitalik. I maintain the Ethereum Python client and write a blog. I'm the chief scientist of the Ethereum project.
So basically, you kind of probably noticed that every proof of stake design uses security deposits or surety bonds or we have multiple names for them. But the idea is that if you have people put stake on deposit, then you can punish them for double signing, say. And so the nothing at stake problem, which is the classic problem with proof of stake, is basically being addressed by like all these projects in the same way. And I think that it's like the canonical way to address the nothing at stake problem.
Do we want to explain what nothing at stake is?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the basic idea is that in a proof of work system, if the blockchain forks, and there's sort of one chain of blocks, we'll call it fork A, and then maybe an attacker starts a fork called fork B, and you as a miner have a choice. You can either mine on fork A or you can mine on fork B. You can't mine on both. I mean, if you do, then you're just splitting up your hash power, and you're half as strong on each one. And so if you think that fork A is going to be, you have the incentive to put all of your mining power on fork A and fork A only. In sort of the very old, naive proof of stake designs, the situation was that, well, if you have fork A and fork B, then you're sort of voting on fork A with your coins on fork A, and you can also vote on fork B with your coins on fork B. And so the two choices of whether or not to vote on fork A and whether or not to vote on fork B are sort of completely separate. And because of that, everyone has the incentive to vote on every fork at once, and therefore, theoretically, if an attacker controls even the tiniest portion of stake, they're basically going to win. So the solution that pretty much a lot of people have independently come up with to nothing at stake is this idea of slasher, with aka security deposits, aka a whole bunch of other things, where the idea is that in order to participate in the stake process, you put down a security deposit, and if you ever get caught voting for two blocks at the same height, then someone else can take the two of your signatures, make what's called an evidence transaction containing both of them, put it into the blockchain, steal your deposit, and get some portion of it for themselves. So in that case, you're just explicitly forbidding this idea of voting on multiple forks at the same time.
Yeah, it's cool. It's like, just intuitively, it's like bringing transparency to validation. And so when you cause a fork, as long as the system can create evidence so that the system knows, everybody knows who caused the fork, then they can be punished. And by slashing the coins, they're disincentivized from creating forks.
Should I bring up a contentious point? So in the Tendermint proposal, blocks never can get uncreated. They only get added to the blockchain, similar to what Vlad wants to produce. But in Bitcoin, it's not the case, and you have to wait for more confirmations for your spend to get more secure over time. A problem that can happen is if two people desperately want two different blocks to be the next block, and they're both willing to spend tons and tons of money to make their block be the next block, that can cause the system to break.
So, I think the way to think, like the way to sort of think about this in terms of more traditional language is there's this idea of the CAP theorem that's been around for a bunch of decades, which is that in the event of a partition, a distributed system can either choose consistency or availability, not both. Bitcoin goes for availability. It says, okay, the system has to keep going no matter what. And the Tendermint basically goes for consistency. So rather than there being two different forks, the system sort of defaults to stopping.
I think it's important as well to make a distinction between traditional consensus currencies and traditional proof of work, proof of stake currencies, because in proof of work, consensus is reached iteratively. There's no notion of all the nodes necessarily reaching universal agreement. New blocks are added, and if you like that block and you think it has the most work or the most signatures, you can add a new block. The difference with conventional consensus is that all nodes, or at least a certain portion of nodes, should reach a universal consensus in a single step. So typically you can guarantee that a Byzantine quorum of nodes has reached consensus using traditional consensus protocols. So if that number of nodes has reached consensus, they shouldn't then go and decide on a different consensus in the next iteration. So that's why you're able to say, well, if you've agreed to one thing, you can't now go and agree to something else because you've already all agreed to one thing. Whereas with a traditional blockchain, it's kind of considered normal that a fork might occur. So they're quite a fundamental difference, I think.
So kind of the trade-off is that, sure, at least it's two. So the trade-off is that if you want a block to be final, then you're going to need to punish people for double signing. But say in Zach's case, where people have a huge incentive to spend a lot of money to create a valid block, they might be able to pay people enough to cause this double spending. And so the question of how do you resolve forks or choose between forks in a proof of stake algorithm is a contentious one. Some people prefer to have a fixed fork scoring rules that make the attacker spend as much money as possible to make their fork win. Other systems prefer to say that if there's a fork, everything that's if the fork happened recently, everything since that fork is just scrapped, and we punish everyone and restart. Or if it happened too late, then we say that it's invalid because it appeared too late. And the issue there is that you can't really prove to new nodes what fork appeared too late, but you still might act on it because the full nodes who are bonded do know who's late. So I guess we maybe talk about this problem of how to choose between forks. So Jay wants it.
Thanks. Yeah, just wanted to add that, yeah, we'll talk about the forking thing. But to address the question of what happens when an attacker with a lot of money wants to destroy or cause a double spend in a proof of stake system, I think the answer, or the way to think about it, is to look at it as if it were Bitcoin. And the equivalent analogy in Bitcoin would be an attacker who puts a lot of money into mining power, either by having literally a ton of racks with miners and putting a bunch of electricity into it. So investing in that kind of infrastructure in order to attack the coin is the similar analogy. And so what happens when somebody with a lot of money destroys consensus in a proof of work mining algorithm or coin is they have, if they have over 50% or maybe 33%, depending on how you look at it, if they have over 50% or if they have the majority of mining power, then that algorithm has been destroyed. So how do you recover from that? So that's how I see it. I see it as we need to look at how to recover from that case. And in Bitcoin, the answer is not clear. Maybe you choose another algorithm or something, right? Maybe another proof of work algorithm. But in any case, even the solution is to transcend it and to come together and to create consensus again, as if it were a hard fork. And can the system become stronger afterwards is another question. So in proof of stake, with transparency, with public key cryptography, you can actually figure out who caused the fork, right? And then their deposited coins or collateral can be slashed, and that makes the whole thing anti-fragile.
So something that worries me about doing the hard fork every time there's a disagreement like this is because now the programmers are the consensus mechanism, and I think the programmers also can be bribed. So another way to do it is two people really want to have first service. They both want their block to be first. So whichever one's willing to burn more money, we let them be first in line. And then whatever prize they're fighting over mostly gets destroyed.
Yeah, something I think that's worth remembering with all these proof-of-stake schemes is, while on the one hand the advantage is that you can confiscate the financial resource of somebody that's tried some kind of malfeasance, they've equivocated, they've signed 2 messages when they should have only signed 1, is that you can take their financial resource away, you can punish them. The problem with proof of stake is that the resource itself is an endogenous form of value. So in a situation where, for example, some kind of attack has been successful or some other forces come to bear on the currency that devalues it, now all of a sudden the resources you need to participate in the network are much more easily acquired. So right at the moment where you need bigger defenses, you actually have weaker defenses. I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind when considering all of these proof-of-stake schemes. The big advantage is that you can punish people. The disadvantage is that your financial resource you're using to secure voting rights is valued. The value is an endogenous value. It comes about as a value of the network, and if exactly at that moment when it's being attacked, that's when the value of the resources that you that are used to apportion voting privileges kind of collapse, and that's a big difficulty of these schemes.
Well, one sort of counter argument that I sometimes make to that is pointing out that in an ASIC-dominated proof-of-work design, the fact is, if Bitcoin if people think that there's going to be an unending series of 51% attacks against Bitcoin, then the value of Bitcoin is going to very quickly drop to something like, $5, $1, whatever. Therefore, people are going to stop mining, and the value of the Bitcoin ASICs is going to drop to something like $1 each. And therefore, because of that, the ASICs themselves, just because of that belief alone, the ASICs themselves could be very easily just bought up by the attacker. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So ASICs kind of end up sharing most of these sort of endogenous value properties that proof-of-stake coins actually have.
I think that's true, but the difference is, playing devil's advocate, that the sunk costs in mining infrastructure, you have to buy the ASICs, you have to install them in a hosting setup, and especially Bitcoin mining architectures are very specialized, so you can't easily dismantle them and recover your funds. So you're, at least for a period of time, you're forced to continue as you are with your sunk capital costs. Whereas with proof of stake, the variation in the value of the currency can happen very quickly, and you can acquire new currency quickly. But I think, it's definitely a problem with hardware too, to some extent.
No. So the argument here is that mining has two costs. It has a like mining is kind of it exhibits a sort of hysteresis effect in that there's two costs of mining. One cost is a capital cost, that's the cost of buying the hardware, and the second cost is the electricity cost of running the hardware. So if you are already mining, then you've already paid the first cost, and you only need to pay the second cost. So the idea is that there's actually sort of two different prices of sort of thresholds of mining profitability. There's the threshold at which it makes sense to increase your mining level, and the threshold at which it makes sense to decrease it. And one of them could easily be like 3 or 4 times the other. And I think, even right now we've seen the value of Bitcoin drop by a factor of 4, and mining has only just flatlined like a month ago. So, and it hasn't even started decreasing. So, it's. But even still, like I think if it gets to the point where it becomes certain that an attacker is going to attack the network, then once the value drops by more than 3x, after that it's sort of linear again. Yeah.
So in Bitcoin, if someone wants to avoid being a victim of a double spend attack, they can sort of wait. That's one way of raising the cost. Is there an analogy in the proof of stake system?
So the idea with so first of all, it depends on what kind of proof of stake system you're going with. In general, there's sort of two competing models, where one model is that there's only a few signers that have to sign every block, and then the other model is more Tendermint style, where every signer signs every block. Now, the idea is that with the Tendermint style model, one confirmation is always enough, because if there's a double spend that's even one confirmation long, then at least a third of the signers get slashed, and that's pretty much you like immediately jump straight to the highest level of security you can possibly have. So that's the sort of model that favors consistency over availability. If we're going with an availability over consistency model, where you only need to have a few signers and it's a randomly selected set, and then maybe it's okay to have forks competing for some period of time, then in that case it's still kind of like Bitcoin, where it's kind of like an exponential level of security that's eventually increasing one, and sort of you can choose, do you want to be here, do you want to be here, and so forth.
So I think the answer there illustrates some of the different approaches. So it's possible to have a consensus, a cryptocurrency that uses conventional Byzantine consensus to bring all the nodes to universal agreement. And in that case, you know that 2/3 of the nodes have to be good, and that they've all reached agreement. So if you know that all of the good nodes, all the correct nodes have reached agreement, then you should be able to accept that result right away, unless you suspect that less than 2/3 of the nodes are good, i.e. that some kind of adversary has compromised more than 1/3 of the nodes. And in that situation, some kind of network reorganization is going to be possible. But so long as you believe that 2/3 of the nodes are good, then you can accept the result right away. You don't have to wait for a series of confirmations, and that's one of the big advantages of conventional consensus, as opposed to something that's derived directly from proof of work, which can fork.
I guess this is also a good time to raise a sort of secondary issue, which is that in conventional computer science, we tend to prefer guarantees of the form at least 2/3 of the guys are good guys. But here, with some of these proof-of-stake designs, we're actually also trying to make guarantees of a different sort, which is that if there is a consistency failure, so if there is a fork at some particular height, then we know that 1/3 of all the nodes get slashed. So we actually know that there's a strong economic disincentive, and that economic disincentive has a certain very large size. So that's kind of interesting, because I think in a model where you have sort of semi-trusted nodes that have a bunch of different companies, and if one of them does something really bad, you can always go after them in a court of law, then 2/3 is a decent way of doing it. But here it's a free entry system, anyone can participate, and you don't necessarily even have assurances that even the majority of them are necessarily motivated to act correctly. So it's sort of one benefit that Tendermint style, a sort of hardline security deposit, everyone gets slashed in a fork sort of proof of stake has, is that if you you know, because if there exists a fork, a third of the signers get slashed, you know for a fact that people have a massive disincentive not to participate in a fork, and so you know that people have a massive incentive to, say, secure themselves.
Yeah, going back to the proof of work and the mining equipment commitment, where we were saying that in a proof of stake coin, should it be attacked, the cost of the coin will go down, whereas in a proof of work, the miners still have their investment, so it's like a sunk cost. Yeah, in proof of stake, if you have the same incentives as Bitcoin, so like if Bitcoin were running on Tendermint with the same reward scheme, then the amount of, so all of that stake will be at stake. It would be as if in Bitcoin, if there was a fork or a double spend attack, the mining equipment of the attackers vanished. So in some sense, it's even stronger than proof of work. And I forgot the other thing I wanted to say, so moving on.
So in Tendermint, they're using the same bonds to secure every single block. Another way to do it is if people want to spend money in a block, we make a bond specifically for that block to cover just that money, and then we have a security deposit for every single amount of money that's spent that's the same size as the amount of money that's spent. So if you double spend, then you destroy the same amount of money at the same time.
Which becomes problematic once you start having meta protocols and subcurrencies where you can't even quantify their value.
You know, like contracts, maybe. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Proof of work also solves the coin distribution problem.
Right.
And I understand that's a lot more difficult in the proof of stake system, or at least takes a different form. Can you speak to that?
Yeah.
Sure, it's just an independent problem. You have to solve the distribution problem, and then you have a proof of stake system. And you can actually issue funds or just even destroy funds in a proof of stake system. But basically, distribution is regarded as a kind of independent problem. One more thing before I take your question about this kind of question of when do transactions get confirmed and when can they no longer get reversed. For every proof of stake system, there is a limit at which if your transaction gets that far, it will never be reversed. And the reason that that's the case is because people have to unbond eventually, and signatures from people who are unbonded can't be considered as part of the consensus. And so if your transaction gets beyond the bonding period, then there's no way in any proof of stake system that it would be removed. Now, and different proof of stake systems also have different depths to which they can have forks. Some of them will allow forks all the way to when the bonder is bonded. Some of them will only allow a certain depth at which, say, signatures can be included on blocks. Some of them only allow kind of one step until it's final. So the concern is that there's a trade-off between kind of finality and liveness, which is like this availability consistency trade-off.
Yes, so the on the particular trade-off you mentioned, another thing to consider is that there are many ways to attack a proof of stake currency. If you require a certain number of signatures, you might think, well, the obvious way to attack it is to acquire enough stake that you can create an alternative number of signatures in a fork. But actually, there are other ways. You can just withhold your signatures, right? So if a proof of stake scheme requires a certain portion of the stake to vote for a block to be correct and minted, well, what happens if that stake is becomes owned by an adversary who just decides to withhold his voting power? Nothing happens, right? The network stalls. So there are many subtle ways that you can use your control of the stake to attack a network, not just double signing. But in regards to double signing, for example, one might just say that forking is completely not allowed, and that if two versions of a distributed ledger appear, and you want to determine which is the correct ledger, rather like we do in Bitcoin. So in Bitcoin, when you have two forks, what you do is you just choose the fork which has the most work in it, right, which has the sum aggregate difficulty solved, if you like, in the puzzles, the hashing puzzles, the most zeros in front of those hashes. A kind of proof of stake equivalent might be to say, right, you've got two different versions of the ledger. What we're going to do is we're going to go look at these two different versions, and we're going to just factor out signatures from any node that is signed twice, right? So any node that's signed twice, the signature just disappears on both sides of the fork, if you want to call it that, and you just end up choosing the one that's got the most signatures remaining. So that's a kind of simple approach that's roughly analogous to the proof of work system, I suppose.
Let's see.
Yeah, there's a question from there.
Yeah.
Is this the moon like how this is correct? Using this scoring.
That's how I read it.
Okay. So I have a couple of things to ask you. First thing is that I've heard people, in speaking about proof of stake, use the word people. So for example, 1/3 of people are slashed. That's not accurate. It's 1/3 of the voters are slashed. And that could be one person. The network could contain, for example, 1,000 people. And one person could have 2/3 of the vote easily. Second is that an assertion was made that the distribution problem is independent to consensus and security. I believe that's not true at all, because in proof of stake, it totally depends on who has the currency, and that depends on how it's distributed, and therefore they're the ones who security depends on. So that leads to my question. In your systems, how are these coins, or whatever you call them, how are they minted, and who gets them?
So I can try to address that first, just because I have the mic. And so one way in which you might, I'm going to try to show that it is independent. So one way is you can even make it proof of work like in its distribution. So in the first 2 years, say, of a coin, you can have it be proof of work, and you can have the reward taper off. So the proof of work requirement tapers off over time. That's one way you can start off with a proof of work distribution scheme and then have it be secured by proof of stake afterwards. And the other thing is, like, there's a bunch of exchanges now, so you can have exchanges just sell coins. I mean, I'm not saying this is legal or that we should do this. I'm just saying this is another way to do it. Hello? And another crazy thing you might try is you might try to put the distribution mechanism into the blockchain, so that maybe it's like a system of voting, and so maybe the stakeholders can vote on proposals to give more coins away. So that's another way you can do it. It's a crazy idea, and I kind of want to try it, but yeah, anyway.
I think one of the ideas that BitShares has is their concept of delegated proof of stake, and the idea there is basically that the stakeholders vote on who gets newly issued coins, and the advantage of the mechanism is that theoretically these new coins could go to whoever is actually doing like work to improve the ecosystem and improve the network and so forth. Like, I'm not sure who said it, but it was said, I think, somewhere that if Bitcoin had been issuing its coins through DPoS instead of through proof of work, it could have hired 5,000 developers by now. So, oh right, excellent. So that's kind of one interesting approach, have some kind of in-protocol governance algorithm for sort of somehow voting or deciding on who gets the issuance. Another approach is that there's people have been thinking of some of these sort of one-per-person schemes where basically you can get a coin by solving a CAPTCHA problem between 2015 February 17th 10 o'clock and 2015 February 17th 10:20, and then the theory is that every single human has the incentive to spend as much time as they can solving CAPTCHAs during that very specific period. And if your CAPTCHA mechanism is secure, the resulting distribution should be reasonably close to actually getting one thing per person. So that's an approach. I think ultimately, you should also ask, what do we want our distribution systems to do? You know, do we want them to be fair? Do we want them to sort of subsidize good activities? In Bitcoin, you know, it subsidizes security, but proof of stake provides security more cheaply as a theory. So if we want it to be fair, this one thought that I have is that I don't think any individual currency is probably going to be all that fair. Like, you know, even with Bitcoin, 90% of them will have been produced by the year 2025. What about all the people in the 22nd century? So I think it's more that the whole ecosystem of coins coming in and new ones constantly popping up is what's going to provide the fairness and sort of make the system, you know, more equal across centuries.
We should close on that if we can. Maybe Tom, and then
one last question. So my understanding is like the one property of proof of work is that you have accumulated exponentially harder to reverse anti transaction. And if that seems to be really important, at least in the private chain, when you, for example, the CEO could potentially control all of those, but it'd be really hard for him to reverse and do all the work. How do you solve that in proof of stake?
So there's two kinds of fork hardness in proof of work, right? One question is, if you have some portion of hash power that's between say 1% and 49%, what is the probability from if your fork starts off X blocks back, or let's say K blocks back, then what is the probability that your fork will succeed? And the answer there is X over 1 minus X to the K, where X is your percentage of hash power. And so, you know, it is kind of exponential. The second question is, what is the cost? And the cost is linear in the number of blocks. So in proof of stake, meanwhile, like once again, it depends on the consistency availability trade-off. So if your coin prefers consistency, then it's going to say that in order to double spend even one block, you have to slash everyone. So sort of it hits the ceiling. It's a sort of quick, although like sort of vertical function where it hits the ceiling immediately, and then it's just pretty, you know, after that it's basically free. If you have a more sort of availability favoring algorithm, then, you know, there's a sort of exponential function where, let's say, during each block, on average, 1% of the deposits get slashed. So, you know, you have 1% here, then 1% of the remaining ones, and 1% of the remaining ones sort of approaches some maximum.